So we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. We're going to talk about the $15,000 first-time homebuyer tax credit. We're going to talk about builders, developers, affordable housing, addressing discrimination, big banks, and FHA lending, and how that's tied to the Community Reinvestment Act. We're going to talk about foreclosures and evictions and tenants, what their rights look like. We're going to talk about tax reform and the associated impact on the housing market. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to talk first about the first-time homebuyer tax credit, but I thought that I would read this. Now, anything that a lot of the data that I'm pulling is from joebiden.com/housing. So if you guys want to get the source of the information, joebiden.com/housing. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, though, frankly, is the impact of what he's proposing. So let me just first kind of read what joebiden.com/housing's kind of overture is for his plan, which is that, it says Joe Biden's running for president to rebuild the middle class and ensure that this time everyone comes along. He believes the middle class isn't a number, but a value set, which includes the ability to own your own home and live in a safe community. Housing should be a right, not a privilege. So let's just take that sentence into consideration for a second. So then he goes on to say, today, however, far too many Americans lack access to affordable and quality housing. Nationwide, we have a shortage of available affordable housing units for low-income individuals. Tens of millions of Americans spend more than 30% of their income on housing, leaving them with nowhere near enough money left over after they meet their other needs, from groceries to prescription drugs. And again, tens of millions of Americans to live in homes that endanger their health and safety. So communities of color are disproportionately impacted by the failure in our housing markets, which with homeownership rates for blacks and Latino individuals falling far below the rate for white individuals. And because homeownership is how families save and build wealth, historically, these racial disparities and how home ownership contribute to the racial wealth gap, it's far past time to put an end to systemic housing discrimination and other contributors to this disparity. And as president, Joe Biden will invest $640 billion over the next 10 years, so every American has access to housing that is affordable, stable, safe, and healthy, accessible, energy efficient, and resilient, and located near good schools with a reasonable commute to their job. It's a lot to promise. Let's see how he delivers. And then it goes on to say that his principles for housing are that it's, number one, affordable, taking no more than 30% of the income, so they have left money left over to meet their other needs. That it's stable, providing families with the consistency they need to maintain jobs, perform well in school, and develop social networks necessary for well-being. That it's safe and healthy, protecting families from environmental and social risks, from polluted air to lead contamination to gun violence. To accessible, meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities so they can live in their communities. Energy efficient and resilient, meaning they want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and withstanding the impacts of climate change, and located near good schools and with reasonable commute to their jobs. So that's the kind of overture, of course, that joebiden.com/housing has for Joe Biden's plan for the housing market. So let's talk first about the first-time homebuyer tax credit of $15,000. So he's proposing a $15,000 first-time homebuyer tax credit, which would be accessed immediately by the buyer, thereby serving as, down payment assistance. So when you think about, the fact that prices are very high right now in our market, near record highs, along with strict lending standards, it makes it difficult for a lot of people to break into the housing market and come up with the cash that they need to secure a mortgage. And so if you look at first-time home buyers, which, by the way, is defined by the federal government as somebody that has not owned a home in the past 3 years, not necessarily a first-time home buyer, you just haven't owned a home in the past 3 years. So last month, it made up 32% of all homeowners. Nationally and historically, it's really more around like 45% if you look in the 90s and early 2000s, but it really has dipped since then. And so the tax credit that he's proposing could, frankly, obviously it would be great for buyers, right, that just don't have the cash to be able to get into a home, but it could exacerbate the inventory shortage that we already have. It's like pouring gasoline onto the housing market that's already on fire by juicing demand even more. Frankly, it's pretty simple economics if you think about it. You put increased demand into a market with a critical shortage of inventory, and it's going to push prices up. So it'll open some doors for first-time home buyers, but I don't think it's going to open it very wide. I mean, of course, it all hinges, of course, on this bill actually gaining approval. But if you look at the math on this, let's take an FHA loan, 3.5% down. So if you're going to buy a $400,000 house, 3.5% down on a $400,000 house is $14,000. That means that you have $1,000 left over that you can contribute toward closing costs. Closing costs being usually somewhere between 1.5% and 2.5% of the purchase price. You've got your down payment and you've got your closing costs. Well, you can get the seller to pay your closing costs. And with this first-time homebuyer tax credit, that literally means that a buyer can buy a house for no money down. Now, what isn't necessarily mentioned in the housing section of joebiden.com/housing is this plan to also slash $10,000 worth of student loan debt, which frankly would be great because, millennials especially are crippled by, student loan debt. But if the payment remains the same, then that really won't impact the borrower's ability to afford more home because it won't change the payment. It won't be taken into account in the qualifying debt to income ratio. But if the borrower has the ability to re-amortize the loan, it will of course give people kind of the boost that they need to get into homeownership. And so what's going to happen here if this passes is it's going to widen the buyer pool in a section of the market that frankly has the lowest inventory by percentage if you look at purchase price. I mean, locally here in Charleston, the month supply of inventory in the Charleston Tri-County area for properties under $400,000 is less than 1 month. Now, if we back up and we look at it last year, it was about 2.5 months in January. But if you back all the way up to about, I guess more than that now, more than 10 years ago, but summer of 2009, it was over a year. It was about 12.5 months supply of inventory. So now, we're in this huge seller's market. And for buyers, it makes things a little more palatable. It makes the barrier to entry a lot less. But make no mistake, by increasing the buyer pool, by essentially increasing demand in an extremely low inventory environment, what's going to happen? Of course, prices are going to go up. Now, why did we have, if we look as a comparison, of course, the housing supply in this section of the market topped out, a little over a year supply of inventory again back in summer of 2009. But why was that? We had very loose lending standards. We have a ton of people that were buying properties speculatively as investors in those price ranges because you could buy something and rent it out and get a cash on cash return of 10 to 15%, sometimes 20%. Those percentages are not there by and large right now because of the fact that we're in a much different market. So although this stimulus obviously will help millennials, first-time home buyers, or people that haven't owned a home in the past 3 years, we are, again, fueling the fire on the demand side of supply and demand without really addressing supply, which is the major issue. So the next thing that kind of makes sense to talk about is how that's going to impact home builders and all of the regulatory costs that they experience when they go and they build a home. And so I'm going to talk about that when we come back. Again, we've got a lot of ground to cover as it relates to Biden's impact on the housing market now that he's president. And of course, if you have questions, comments, concerns, you're thinking about buying or selling a home, we're here for you. We'd love to help. We've been in the top 1% of agents every year since 2009. And we'd love the opportunity to at least walk you through what we're seeing in the market and where the opportunities exist, whether on the buyer side or on the seller side. But I will say this, the person or the company or the real estate team with the inventory is the one that's winning right now. And by that, I mean shadow inventory. Obviously, you have access to everything that's currently on the market. You can just pull up Zillow and see what's available. But it's all the people that particular real estate agent or company or team is communicating with that are not on the market that represent golden opportunities for you as a buyer, or at least the team's ability to go out and find a property that's not yet listed for sale, which has been, frankly, a huge part of our business over the past year, especially during the pandemic. So if that's something you'd like to learn more about, feel free to give me a call, 843-400-8009. That's 843-400-8009. Or check us out online. A lot of great content on there. Listingsincharleston.com. Listingsincharleston.com. Stick around, folks. We'll be right back for more of the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show on the Big Talker 1250 WTMA.
Have a real estate question? Ask Brian Beatty. Send him an email, lowcountryhomesales@gmail.com. The Brian Beatty Real Estate Show is on 1250 WTMA.